Hey, y'all, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host. My name is Cassandra, and this is the You Never Would Have Known podcast. Thank you all so much for listening to last episode about JFK, and I'm so excited that you're back for a new episode. And this week, we're talking about the Black Dahlia. Before we get started today, I just want to tell you about an awesome sponsor I have for my episodes. It's actually through the app that I make this podcast on called Anchor. It's completely free, and there's a creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, which is exactly what I do. They also distribute your podcast for you. So I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so many more places I wouldn't be without them. It's completely free, and you can make money with no minimum listenership. If you go to the Anchor app right now, or you can go to anchor.fm and you can get started today. So I actually had never really looked into this case before. I'd heard of it. I'd heard of the Black Dahlia, but I don't think that I'd ever really read anything about it. But I've definitely learned a lot for this podcast. And I'm really excited to share it with you guys because there's definitely a lot of interesting things going on in this case. So the Black Dahlia, she has an actual name. Her name is Elizabeth Short. She went by Beth, and she was a native of Boston, Massachusetts. She spent her early life living in Medford, Massachusetts, and Florida. She was the third of five daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. So she has four sisters, and her dad has like the coolest job, okay? He builds miniature golf courses. Like, why did nobody tell me that was a career option? But anyway, he builds miniature golf courses. That's how he supports the family. And it's going really well for him until 1929 when the stock market crashes, because then like people can barely afford food, let alone miniature golf courses. So I guess that's why nobody told me that was a career option. But the stock market crashes, he loses most of his savings, and his family is just completely broke. They have no money. So in 1930, just a year after the stock market crash, her father's car is found on the Charleston Bridge, and it is assumed that he jumped off. So now Beth, her four sisters, and her mom are all on their own. They move into a small apartment in Medford, and her mom becomes a bookkeeper to support her and her five daughters. They're all on their own. But then in 1942, 12 years later, after all of this suffering and all of this hard work her mom has done, she gets a letter in the mail from her dead husband telling her he's not actually dead. He faked his own death and moved to California to start a new life. I just have a lot of thoughts about that. Like, imagine you're a widow, and then 12 years after your husband's death, your husband sends you a letter in the mail. It's like, JK, like, what? So Beth gets excited when she finds out her dad's alive, even though she hasn't seen him since she was 6 years old. But she decides that she's going to move to California, move in with her dad. And she was so excited because she had a dream of being an actress in Hollywood. That was what she wanted more than anything. So she moves to California. She moves in with her dad, who's working at a shipyard in San Francisco. And she thinks that this is going to be like amazing and she's going to become an actress. But it isn't that easy for her. So she spends about a year with her dad trying to become an actress. And eventually her dad gets mad, saying that she's basically like freeloading and she's not paying anything. So he kicks her out. So now she's basically homeless. She's going from friends couches, living on friends' couches. At one point, she's living with an Army Air Force sergeant who was abusing her. So she's just having a really rough go of it. Her dad had kicked her out in January of 1943, and then in September of 1943, she's actually caught by authorities underage drinking at a bar, and the authorities send her back to Medford, Massachusetts, where her mom lives. But she didn't want to live in Medford. She moved to Florida, actually, and she would occasionally go visit Massachusetts. But in Florida, she meets a man named Matthew Michael Gordon Jr., who was a decorated Army Air Force officer. And she says that Gordon had actually proposed to her while he was recovering from a plane crash. And she accepted, but Gordon actually died in a second crash just a week before Japan ended the war. So that's really sad. So now she's basically a widow almost. So she's dealing with that. She decides to move back to Los Angeles to visit another friend, another Air Force lieutenant, Joseph Gordon Flicking, who she had met in Florida, but now is living in Long Beach. And so she goes to visit him and then decides that she's actually going to move back to California, mostly in Los Angeles, because she did want to be an actress. So she rents a room in like near Hollywood, and she is basically back to living in California, trying to be an actress, but she's not really succeeding in the actress area yet. She's trying to get jobs, but she's not getting them. But it's just not working out. So she goes on a trip to San Diego with a guy named Robert Manley. And after her trip, she comes back home to Los Angeles. Her friend Manley, he drops her off at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. And she was supposed to meet her sister, who was visiting that afternoon from Boston. They say that she used the phone in the lobby. She may have even gone to a place called the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge, about half a mile away from the hotel. And then she was never seen again. So on the morning of January 15th, 1947, Betsy Bersinger and her daughter go out for a walk about 10 a.m. And while they're on their walk, she sees what she thinks is a mannequin, a store mannequin. And she thinks it's weird. So she walks up to it and she realizes it's a corpse. It was so pale that it looked like a mannequin. So she calls the police, and what they find is an absolutely gruesome crime scene. She is she was so pale because she had been completely drained of blood. And she had been bisected. She was cut in half. Basically, it was done by someone who had surgical skills. That was the nature of the where she had been bisected. And she had ligature marks on her ankles, wrists, and neck. And she also had cuts from her lips to her ears, which basically made her look like she was smiling. It was an absolutely just gruesome and terrible. And people started talking about this murder because it was so gruesome. And this was back when they still like gave fun little nicknames to murder cases. And there was a movie called The Blue Dahlia, and she would Elizabeth would always wear a lot of black, so that it started calling her the Black Dahlia. That was the nickname for her case, and it became very popular. But it was 1947. They didn't have the technology we have now. And seems like all the cases that I say this, but they don't know who did it. But we're going to get into the suspects. We're going to get into who could have done it. We can't get into the suspects yet. I almost forgot one of the most important details. So, after her murders, a string of letters were delivered by the U.S. Postal Service, and they were addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers. And they were basically cut out with words from newspapers, like you would see in like a horror movie, like a ransom note, And they all the letter said was here is Dahlia's belonging, letter to follow. And it had Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, an address book that had some some pages ripped out of it. And it had all been cleaned with gasoline. And her body had also been cleaned with gasoline, basically in an attempt to get rid of fingerprints. There were a couple of partial fingerprints, but they weren't able to use them for testing because they were contaminated, or there was something wrong with them in transit. Something happened to them. They couldn't use them. And then on March 14th, a couple months after the Black Dahlia murders, they found a note in Venice that said, "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this is the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that or this. Sorry, Mary." And then there was a pile of clothing, and they weren't sure who the clothing belonged to. It wasn't really able to identify the owner, from what I can tell. So weird stuff, right? Her belongings and these letters show up. It's just weird. It's a weird case. And since we're getting into the suspects next, it's cool to know over 60 people confessed to the Black Dahlia murder. I know we've talked about cases before where people will confess and then it turns out not to be them. But this one had so many confessions, it was considered an obstruction of justice because, I mean, there was no way that 60 people did this. Most of them were considered just false leads. They weren't anything. But there were 24 people that the Los Angeles District Attorney was able to consider actual suspects, which is crazy. So this is probably going to end up being a long episode because I have a lot of suspects for you. And I'm not even going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about the main ones, but there are still so many. And they have no idea who did this, basically. It's tragic. And that's why this is such a famous case. This was one of the biggest cases for its time. And it never was solved, so that's why it's so famous. But let's go ahead and get into the suspects now. So the first suspect that we have is named Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey was a surgeon in Los Angeles. He was a really good surgeon, and he was 67 at the time of the murders. He wasn't known to be violent or have a history of any violence. But after his death, some weird stuff started coming up. He died in October of 1946. Or I'm sorry, no. He died in January of 1948. And his autopsy showed that he was suffering from a degenerative brain disease. So even though he had been a really nice man without a history of violence, the disease that he had could have caused him to have some kind of, he could have snapped. It could have caused him to do something like this. And when he died, his will actually had his mistress as his main beneficiary instead of his wife, which is crazy. That would be crazy now, but especially crazy then, So they, and it's important that he was a surgeon. They thought that the person who killed Elizabeth was a surgeon, and that was how he was able to have such clean cuts on her body. And it was said that him and his mistress used to watch movies of surgeries and autopsies on their dates, which is so strange. And it said that the reason he left his will to his mistress instead of his wife was that his mistress knew a terrible secret and knew about something that he had done, and she was blackmailing him into giving her all of his money when he died. Some people think that he was actually performing abortions, which were illegal at the time, and that was the reason that she was, blackmailing him. But he only lived one block south of where Elizabeth's body was found. And his daughter was actually friends with Elizabeth's sister, Virginia. So they were connected in several ways, and he was connected to the location. So it's definitely strange. There's definitely a lot of weird stuff going on there. And they did decide that he was a suspect. The authorities decided that he definitely could have done it, but he wasn't charged or anything. The next suspect we have is a man named Norman Chandler. Now, this one is kind of weird and also proven false, but in a book that was written by Donald Wolfe in 2005, he had a theory that Norman Chandler had impregnated Elizabeth Short while she was working as a call girl. And then he had Bugsy Siegel murder her. But it was found in her autopsy that she was not pregnant, and it's not believed that she was a call girl. So this is just kind of a unsupported theory. The next suspect we have is a man named Joseph A. Dumas. He was a soldier, and he was from New Jersey, and he had been cleared multiple times of doing this, but every time he has been arrested or spoken to police, he confesses that he murdered Elizabeth. But it wouldn't have been possible the way that timing worked out, where he was, things like that. But every time he's ever been arrested for any other offense, he, well into the 1950s, would admit that he killed Elizabeth Short. But as we see in tons of cases, there are often times where people will admit to a crime that they didn't do. No, I'm not really sure why that happens, but it does. So even though he confessed, it wasn't him. Our next suspect is a man named Patrick O'Reilly. He was a doctor who knew Short through a nightclub owner. O'Reilly was good friends with a man named Mark Hansen, who owned a nightclub that Elizabeth would go to. And Patrick O'Reilly had a history of sexually motivated violent crimes. He was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon because he took his secretary to a motel and sadistically beat her almost to death for no other reason other than to satisfy his sexual desires without intercourse. So that is very, very creepy. And O'Reilly had his right pectoral surgically removed. And investigators found something similar in the mutilation of Elizabeth's body. So, O'Reilly's just a weird guy, and it's just weird. So believe it or not, those suspects I just gave you are the least credible of the suspects. There are a lot more who are much more credible. But before we get into that, some people believe that it could have been a woman. And a couple of women did confess, but police found that none of them could have done it. But some people believe that Elizabeth had actually been bisected because the person who killed her was a woman, and she couldn't lift Elizabeth's body to dispose of her, so she had to cut her in half to lift her. And some people, there were news stories that said that Elizabeth was a lesbian or she was bisexual. And that was not, like, people weren't cool with that back then. So that's like a very interesting side note, but it's pretty much believed that a woman could not have murdered Elizabeth. So, on to the more credible suspects. We have Robert Manley, whose name might sound familiar to you because we just talked about him earlier. He was friends with Elizabeth, and he was one of the last people that saw her before she was murdered. But Robert Manley took 2 polygraph tests, and he passed them both. He was basically, he had been there, but they were friends, and they don't really think that he could have done it. But he did have some weird issues. He'd been discharged from the army because he had a mental disability. He would have nervous breakdowns, and he also claimed that he would hear voices. He was committed to a hospital in 1954, and he died in 1986. And his death was attributed to an accidental fall. So those things aren't related to Elizabeth, but just weird things. But they were friends, and it's not really believed that Robert would have done this. So next up, we have Mark Hansen. I mentioned Mark Hansen earlier when I was talking about O'Reilly. Mark Hansen was the owner of a nightclub, and he was friends with Elizabeth. He often let Elizabeth stay with him in his home, and Hansen's girlfriend knew Elizabeth. They were friends, and it's said that on a couple of occasions, Mark would try to seduce Elizabeth, but she would refuse. She didn't want to be with him like that. But Hansen's connected with not only Patrick O'Reilly, but also with M.M. Schwartz and Dr. Arthur McGinnis. who are two other suspects that could have murdered Elizabeth. So he just kind of has his feet in a lot of areas almost. It's just kind of weird. He was never officially charged with anything, but there is a chance that, with being involved with so many of the suspects, being Elizabeth's friend, there is a chance that he had something to do with it, even if he didn't directly kill her, in my opinion, at least. That's what makes sense to me, I think. So the next suspect we have is a man named Leslie Dillon. So Leslie Dillon wrote to the LAPD, and he was asking one of the detectives his theories on the Black Dahlia case. And he said that this was because he was interested in sadism and sexual psychopaths, and he wanted to write a book on those subjects, which I want to say is weird, but I guess I also make content on these subjects, so I can't judge him. So he never confessed to the murder, but he did say that his friend, Jeff Connors, did kill Elizabeth. So now Dillon and the detective, they're writing back and forth. And at some point, the detective starts to think that maybe Connors isn't real. Maybe Dillon made Connors up so that he could cope with the horrible thing that he had done to Elizabeth. So they bring him in and interview him, and he says some weird stuff. He talks about embalming. He talks about draining a body of blood, which we know is something that happened to Elizabeth. She didn't have any blood in her body when they found her. And they, it's just weird. It's just a weird thing. And they kept interviewing him. They kept talking to him, but at some point they just decided that he hadn't done it. He was most likely in San Francisco when the murder took place, and they couldn't conclusively place him anywhere. So he later filed a $100,000 claim against the city of Los Angeles for how he was treated in this case. But the lawsuit was dropped because the LAPD discovered that he was wanted by the Santa Monica police for robbing a hotel while he worked there as a bellhop. So, he's still kind of a sketchy guy. He's still kind of weird, but they don't think that he's the one that did it because they can't place him there. So another suspect is a man named Ed Burns. Ed Burns is not on any of the FBI reports because they didn't take him as a suspect until later. So in all the photos that were recalled of Elizabeth, they were able to identify all the people in them except for one person who they called the unID'd man. And come to find out, this man was named Ed Burns. And when Elizabeth was when she was young and she was out, she was looking for a husband, she met Ed Burns and they were friends. And Elizabeth actually was obsessed with this case, apparently, of a 6-year-old named Suzanne Degnan who was kidnapped and murdered in Chicago, and her body was found dismembered in a sewer. So apparently Elizabeth was obsessed with this case, and she would read about it, which I also want to say is weird, but I'm studying her case, so I guess I can't really judge her yet again. I can't judge people. So when she is obsessing over this case, she meets Ed, and he is in the USC School of Medicine. So they meet up a couple of times, and they think that even Elizabeth talked so much about this case that it could have just driven Ed crazy. He didn't want to hear about it anymore. And he became just so mad at Elizabeth. And he thought that she loved this little girl's killer more than he loved her. So they think that this case and her obsession with this case could have been the reason that he would have killed her. And actually, in the letter that I read to you earlier, where it says, to who it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but they have not. I am too much of a coward. That letter, in the way that it's written, down the middle, it spells out Ed Burns. And, like I said, they weren't able to figure out whose suicide note this was. So they think it was Ed Burns. But at this point, when he killed himself, the case had been going on for so long. And they didn't want to come out and say, oh, yeah, a dead man killed her. It's too late now. So they never really put him in any of the reports. But it is widely believed that Ed Burns killed Elizabeth. So the next suspect is probably the most widely believed killer. I think that the most people believe that George Hodel was the man who killed Elizabeth. So George Hodel first kind of came under police's view after his daughter accused him of sexually assaulting her. And they say that his daughter's daughter, his granddaughter, was his daughter. So he impregnated his own daughter. But the family, they testified in favor of George. A lot of people think because he was the family breadwinner, he provided for everyone. And so they said that, his daughter was lying. So he ended up not being charged for that. But after this, they thought that maybe he had something to do with Elizabeth's death. And some people believe that Elizabeth and George knew each other somehow, but they did plant bugs in his house to listen to him. And on these recordings, you can hear a woman screaming, but you also can hear him say something like, say that I did kill Elizabeth. They couldn't prove it now. My secretary's already dead, which is like so weird. Like, what a weird thing to say. That's like so cryptic. So it's just weird. So George Hodel's son, Steve, he was looking through a family photo album and he found 2 photos that he didn't recognize, and he thought that they were kind of weird. And he started looking at them and he realized that he thought that they were photos of Elizabeth. And this is really weird. Like, why would his dad have these 2 random photos of this girl who had been murdered? So he takes them to these people who like analyze the photos, and it's kind of torn. Some people think it's her, some people think it's not her. But, in any case, Steve thinks that his dad did this because he doesn't know why else would his dad have these 2 photos of Elizabeth in a photo album. So Steve goes to his childhood home with a police dog, and the police dog alerts that there are human remains in the soil outside the home. So they take a soil sample, and it's found that there is some human remains in the soil in the alley behind the house. And obviously Elizabeth wasn't buried, but this does show that, there's a chance that George Hodel was not, this wasn't unfamiliar territory for him. If he did kill Elizabeth, this wasn't the first time that he had done something like this. There's a chance that he was a serial killer, basically. So Steve Hodel really wants them to dig on the property and see what this test from the soil is showing, but it's private property and the LAPD won't follow up on it. So that kind of really just is the end of the trail there. Steve fully believes that his dad did kill Elizabeth, but there is nothing he can do to prove that. So Elizabeth's case will continue to never be solved. I don't think at this point, so many years later, there's a chance that it will ever be solved. And that's so sad that she doesn't get that justice that she deserves. But, I think that happens a lot in these old cases. And it's important to remember, I wanted to note, it's important to remember that these people, I don't like calling her the Black Dahlia. I like calling her Elizabeth or Beth or Elizabeth Short because she was a person. And I think that it's important that we remember in these cases that even though we are, true crime fans and we like reading about this stuff, that we need to remember that we can't separate the stories from the people. These are people just like us. And they didn't deserve this. So it's truly tragic what happened to Elizabeth. And, I guess we'll probably never know who killed her. And that's really sad. So thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. If you could follow me on Instagram, that is always helpful. My Instagram is @YouNeverWouldHaveKnown, and my personal Instagram is @CassandLane. I often post little polls over there. You guys are actually the ones who chose this episode. I was trying to decide between Elisa Lam and the Cecil Hotel or the Black Dahlia, and you all voted for me to talk about Elizabeth. So was very excited to do so. So follow me over there. Sometimes you guys get little hints and things. But But yeah, I'm so glad you guys were here. I'm so glad you guys learned something you never would have known. And I hope that I will see you all next time in my next episode. Bye.